He wasn't supposed to be back yet. That was the first thing people noticed. Not the moves themselves, not the names on the transaction wire or the lockers being cleared or the 3 new arms suddenly appearing in a bullpen that had been running out of answers. The first thing people noticed was Roberts walking back into Dodger Stadium before anyone expected him. Before the scheduled return date. Before the situation had been given more time to resolve itself through the ordinary mechanisms of a long season. He came back because the ordinary mechanisms had stopped working. Dave Roberts does not make emergency returns for small problems. He does not cut short whatever personal or medical or organizational matter kept him away from the dugout, does not absorb the inconvenience and the disruption of an unscheduled return, unless what is waiting for him at Dodger Stadium cannot wait any longer. Unless the distance between where the team is and where it needs to be has become too large to manage from a phone call. He walked back in. And within hours, the Dodgers organization looked entirely different from the one he had left. 3 lockers. That is the image that stays with you after everything else gets processed, after the transaction wire gets parsed and the roster math gets calculated and the organizational rationale gets constructed and distributed through the usual channels. 3 lockers, emptied. Not in the quiet, gradual way that departures usually happen in professional clubhouses, the slow accumulation of boxes, the deliberate pace of a player who has been given time to say goodbye to the room. These lockers were cleared with the efficiency of a decision that had already been fully made before the players who owned them had finished absorbing the news. Miguel Rojas. Tommy Edman. Kike Hernandez. 3 names. 3 lockers. 3 careers in Dodger blue, ended, or at least interrupted, in the same organizational motion, on the same morning, by a manager who had returned specifically to make this happen. The simultaneity of it is what communicates the seriousness. When a team removes 1 player from the roster, it is a personnel decision. When it removes 3 veterans, 3 players with organizational history and clubhouse presence and names that carry weight in a locker room, simultaneously, on the day the absent manager makes his emergency return, it is a statement about the entire direction of the team. Roberts came back to make a statement. The 3 empty lockers are the statement. Start with Rojas. Because Rojas is the one that requires the most context. Miguel Rojas is not a player who disappears quietly from a roster. He is not a fringe piece, not a depth option activated out of necessity and returned to the minors when necessity passes. He is a veteran presence. A clubhouse voice. The kind of player whose value extends beyond the statistical lines into the room itself, into the conversations that happen before games and after them, into the culture maintenance that teams with championship aspirations need someone to perform. And yet, the numbers had been telling a story that the clubhouse presence couldn't fully contradict. The at-bats that didn't produce. The defensive plays that a younger version of the same player would have made. The gradual, quiet erosion of the tools that made Rojas a Dodger worth keeping, happening slowly enough that on any individual day it was possible to explain away, but accumulated across enough games to become something that a returning manager, seeing the situation fresh, could no longer rationalize. Roberts saw it fresh. And Roberts made the call. Designated for assignment. The language of baseball's middle category, not a release, not a demotion, but a signal that the organization is no longer certain this player belongs on the 40-man roster, and is willing to let the rest of the league make that determination through the waiver process. For Rojas, it landed harder than DFA usually lands. Because the locker was cleared immediately. Because the timing, the same morning as Edman, the same morning as Hernandez, removed any possibility of a quiet, dignified transition. His departure was absorbed into a larger story, his name listed alongside 2 others in a transaction wire that felt less like individual personnel decisions and more like a single, sweeping verdict. Edman is a different kind of hurt. Tommy Edman came to the Dodgers carrying the weight of expectation that trade acquisitions always carry, the implicit promise that the cost paid to acquire him would be justified by the production that followed. That promise had complicated itself over recent weeks. The production that justified the acquisition had become inconsistent in the way that struggling players become inconsistent, not absent entirely, but unreliable in the moments when reliability mattered most. A manager who has been away, who returns with the clarity that distance creates, sees inconsistency differently than a manager embedded in the daily rhythms of a season. The daily manager normalizes. He absorbs the bad days as part of a longer arc and measures the player against his own recent baseline rather than against the standard the team requires. He manages the relationship as much as the performance. Roberts returned without that normalization. He saw the arc from outside it. What he saw was a player whose presence in the lineup had stopped being an asset and started being a question. And Roberts, a manager who built this team's culture on the principle that questions get answered, not managed, chose to answer it. Edman, demoted. The locker, cleared. The question, resolved. And then Hernandez. Again. Kike Hernandez, whose name has now appeared in enough transaction announcements over the past 72 hours to constitute its own separate story, a story within the story, a subplot that keeps refusing to resolve itself into a clean ending. He was banned. Then reinstated. Now designated for assignment again, or demoted, the precise mechanism almost beside the point at this stage because the larger truth is unmistakable. This relationship is finished. Not in the dramatic, door-slamming way of the first announcement. This time it is quieter. More final, in the way that things are final when all the noise has already been made and what remains is simply the administrative confirmation of something everyone in the room already understood. His locker was cleared alongside Rojas and Edman. 3 at once. The organizational decision absorbing the personal one, the transaction wire flattening the complexity of a player's history with a franchise into a single line of text released before the morning shows. Hernandez deserved more than that. Most players do. But this is what the timeline produced, an ending bundled into a larger story, his name the third in a list of 3, the period at the end of a sentence that the Dodgers organization had been trying to finish for days. But Roberts did not return only to subtract. 3 pitchers. Promoted. Into a bullpen that had been stretched and exposed and asked to carry more than its structure was designed to carry. 3 new arms arriving in the same motion that cleared the 3 lockers, the organizational addition and subtraction happening simultaneously, the new pieces sliding into the spaces left by the departing ones before the dust of the departures had settled. This is Roberts' signature. Not the cutting, the replacing. The belief that the answer to a problem is not only removing what isn't working but immediately installing what might. That a bullpen rebuilt is not a bullpen diminished but a bullpen reset, given new options, new matchup tools, new arms that haven't yet accumulated the scar tissue of a difficult stretch. The 3 pitchers promoted carry with them the particular energy of players who have been waiting. Not in the passive sense, not simply occupying roster space in AAA while the major league situation sorted itself out. Waiting with the active, attentive quality of players who understand that opportunity in baseball arrives without warning and disappears just as fast. They were ready when the call came. They had made themselves ready because they understood that at some point, something would break in the major league bullpen and the phone would ring. The phone rang before sunrise. They answered. Roberts, walking into the clubhouse for the first time since his absence began, saw 2 things simultaneously. He saw the problem, the accumulated evidence of a bullpen that had been managed into exhaustion, a roster that had carried underperformance long enough that it had started to normalize, a room that needed someone to walk in and name what everyone already knew without quite saying it. And he saw the solution, not as a finished product, not as a guarantee, but as a direction. The 3 pitchers arriving from AAA. The 3 lockers cleared. The reset, immediate and complete, that only a manager returning from outside the daily rhythm can execute without the relational complications that proximity creates. A manager embedded in the season accumulates debt. Debt to the players he has managed through difficult stretches. Debt to the relationships he has built and maintained. Debt that makes certain decisions feel more expensive than they are, because the human cost of executing them is visible and present and attached to faces he sees every day. Roberts returned without that debt. He walked in clean. And he spent the first hours of his return paying down a set of organizational obligations that had accumulated in his absence, resolving the Hernandez question, the Edman question, the Rojas question, all of them simultaneously, all of them with the clarity that only someone who has been outside the room can fully access. The bullpen, by the end of the morning, looked different. Not just in personnel, in possibility. The three arms promoted from AAA represent matchup options that didn't exist yesterday. They represent the ability to manage late innings with more flexibility, more specificity, more confidence that the pitcher on the mound was chosen because he is the right answer to this particular problem in this particular moment rather than because he is what's left. Roberts understands bullpen construction the way a chess player understands endgame, not as a series of individual moves but as a system, a set of relationships between pieces that either supports the king or exposes him. The bullpen he inherited upon his return was exposing the king. The bullpen he constructed in the hours after his arrival is designed to protect him. Whether it works is a question the season answers. Not this morning. Not this transaction wire. The season. But the intention is clear. The direction is clear. Roberts came back and immediately began building toward October, subtracting what had stopped serving that goal, adding what might, moving with the urgency of a man who understood that the calendar is not a patient document and the games already played cannot be recovered. 3 lockers, cleared. 3 arms, promoted. 1 manager, back. The Dodgers do not wait for problems to resolve themselves. They resolve them. Before the city wakes up, if necessary. Before the rest of the league has time to react. Before the moment passes and the opportunity to reset becomes the regret of having waited too long. Roberts knew that. He came back to act on it. The bullpen, by the time the next game begins, will look like a decision made in full confidence by a man who returned not to observe the situation but to change it. That is what emergency returns are for. That is what this one was for.